In this video, we continue our discussion on Chapter 11, where last time we went over fiscal policy. This time we will go over expansionary fiscal policy by considering fiscal stimulus, the 80 shortfall, the policy target of the government, and then conclude with a summary. With all this in mind, in terms of fiscal policy, we have identified the three options the federal government has in terms of government purchases, income transfers, and taxes, as well as the cumulative effect of a fiscal policy change in that there will be an initial change on aggregate demand, from which a multiplier effect will be kicked off, corresponding to a secondary shift in aggregate demand due to a change in consumption, where the cumulative effect will be the sum of the initial effect plus the secondary change in consumption from the multiplier process. So with these observations in mind, now what we'd like to do is to see how fiscal policy can be used. Where to do so, we will consider a negative demand shock case as well as a positive demand shock case, in which in this video we will begin with the negative demand shock case. Where for an economy in a long-run equilibrium that experiences a negative demand shock, we have seen that the economy will be in a long-run equilibrium at potential real GDP and at the targeted price level, which will correspond to point A in this graphic. Now, should a negative demand shock occur, this will correspond to an initial decline in aggregate demand going from AD to AD1, where holding the price level fixed, aggregate demand is now at point B in terms of Y1 amounts of real GDP being demanded, while quantity supplied in terms of real GDP is at potential real GDP, so this means excess inventories have accrued. With excess inventories have accrued, this kicks off a negative multiplier process in which there will be a secondary leftward shift in aggregate demand due to a decline in consumption from this multiplier effect, in which we can capture this by going from AD1 to AD2, where holding the price level fixed. Real GDP being demanded by this economy is now at Y2, where in terms of this overall effect on aggregate demand, the initial change was going from AD to AD1, where the secondary effect is going from AD1 to AD2, so this means that the cumulative effect is going from AD to AD2 after the initial and secondary effects have been realized, where then this economy then adjusts to the short-run equilibrium at point D, in which there is an unemployment gap in this economy, and there's also been a decrease in the price level of this economy as well. Now, so long as this economy is in the short run and prices are sticky, there will not be long-run self-adjustment, such that if the government would like to intervene and restore long-run equilibrium in this economy, it would like to increase aggregate demand, where it can do so by pursuing expansionary fiscal policy, where this can be achieved by decreasing taxes, increasing government purchases, or increasing income transfers. So then, now having identified expansionary fiscal policy is needed, this policy change that is needed to increase aggregate demand needs to occur such that the economy is initially in its short-run equilibrium state at point D with the unemployment gap and the decrease in the price level. Now, the economy steps in, the government steps in and increases aggregate demand initially with expansionary fiscal policy such that holding the price level fixed, there has been an increase in aggregate demand. This then kicks off a positive multiplier effect, where with this positive multiplier effect, there's a secondary shift in aggregate demand due to an increase in consumption, where after the initial policy change and the increase in consumption from the multiplier effect has been realized, the economy then adjusts to the long-run equilibrium at point G, where at point G, this economy is once again producing at potential real GDP and at the targeted price level P star. So then, in terms of this fiscal policy change that is being pursued by the government, what we've seen then is that the cumulative effect of the policy needs to be greater than that of the unemployment gap. In that, if the government overall targeted the cumulative effect of its policy by the unemployment gap, then after the initial effect has been realized and a positive multiplier effect has been kicked off in the economy, if the cumulative effect lands us in terms of closing the unemployment gap, then after adjustment, this economy would go to a short-run equilibrium in which there's an improved outcome in terms of a smaller unemployment gap, but there would still be an unemployment gap nonetheless in which this economy would be in a short run as opposed to a long run equilibrium. So then what the government needs to do is they need to stimulate aggregate demand by more than the unemployment gap, where this amount is going to be referred to as the 80 shortfall, where in our graph this is going to be by the amount of Y3 minus Y1, where this 80 shortfall is the amount of additional aggregate demand needed to achieve full employment after price level changes, in that there's going to be that initial policy change increasing aggregate demand, in which this kicks off the positive multiplier effect, in which we see that we're above potential real GDP in terms of what's being demanded by agents in the economy at the current moment. But given what's going on in terms of being supplied on the short-run aggregate supply curve, there's incentives for firms to increase the price level on goods and services corresponding to upward movement along the AD and short-run aggregate supply curves, where after adjustment, the economy is precisely where it needs to be in terms of long-run equilibrium, back at the targeted price level, and at potential real GDP. So with the cumulative effect of the policy now found to be by the amount of the 80 shortfall, this means in terms of our policy options and letting the cumulative aggregate demand effect equal to the 80 shortfall, let us see what that means in terms of our formulas that we derived in the last video. Where, beginning with government purchases, we've seen that the cumulative effect of a government purchase change, if we let that equal to the 80 shortfall, will be the multiplier scaled by government purchases, where solving for government purchases, this means dividing through by the multiplier. This means that the government, should they use expansionary fiscal policy in terms of government purchase increases, that means they need to increase purchases by the amount of the 80 shortfall divided by the multiplier effect, such that after the cumulative effect has been realized, what we get back is precisely by that of the 80 shortfall. Where, repeating this, but with respect to taxes, and letting the cumulative effect equal to the 80 shortfall, we've seen that the cumulative effect of a tax change is going to be the multiplier scaled by the MPC scaled by negative taxes, given that taxes are negatively related to aggregate demand. Where, same as before, solving in this case with respect to taxes, this means if the government were to pursue expansionary fiscal policy in the form of tax decreases, to restore the long-run equilibrium, the government would want to decrease taxes by the amount of minus 1 divided by the marginal propensity to consume, scaled by taxes, all scaled by the 80 shortfall, where after the initial effect and the secondary shift has occurred, then the cumulative effect of the tax decrease would be precisely by the amount of the 80 shortfall. And lastly, with respect to income transfers, given that they are identical to taxes, it sans the minus sign, given that there's a positive relationship between income transfers and taxes, we have precisely the same equation with respect to taxes, but in this case we have a positive sign, and that if the government were to pursue expansionary fiscal policy in the form of increasing income transfers, they would like to do so by 1 divided by the MPC scaled by the multiplier, all scaled by the 80 shortfall, such that after the initial increase in aggregate demand and the secondary change in consumption occurs, the cumulative effect of the income transfers will be precisely by that of the 80 shortfall. Where with respect to these amounts, in terms of targeting the cumulative change as the 80 shortfall, we see that in absolute value, income transfers and taxes are identical. And in terms of options overall, government purchases are the cheapest option to pursue, given that government purchases are directly related to aggregate demand, and that if there's a $1 increase in government purchases, then there would be a $1 increase in aggregate demand. Whereas with respect to income transfers and taxes, given that they are related to disposable income, where consumers have the ability to consume or save with disposable income, if there's a $1 increase in income transfers or a $1 decrease in taxes, this will correspond to a $1 increase in disposable income, and only a fraction of that dollar will be made to an increase in consumption, which means only a fraction of that dollar will be made into an increase in aggregate demand as a result. So then in summary, with respect to an economy that is in a short-run equilibrium from a negative demand shock, the government can intervene with expansionary fiscal policy, where the cumulative effect of the policy should be by the amount of the 80 shortfall, and in terms of the 3 options that can be pursued, government purchases are the cheapest option given that they have a direct effect on aggregate demand. And in terms of our model, and considering the cumulative effect, the story that we have then is if an economy is in a long-run equilibrium at point A and experiences a negative demand shock after the cumulative effect has been realized and the economy adjusts to the short-run equilibrium at point B, there will be an unemployment gap in which there's been a decrease in the price level, where in terms of our Phillips curve model, this means rightward movement from point A to point B, in which the economy has an increase in its unemployment rate in which it's above the natural rate of unemployment and sees a decrease in its inflation rate, where the cumulative effect of the negative demand shock corresponds to the economy contracting to a trough at point B, where so long as the economy is in the short run and prices are sticky, the government then intervenes with expansionary fiscal policy, where after the cumulative effect of the expansionary fiscal policy has been realized, and after adjustment, the economy will go to point C, which is a long-run equilibrium in which potential real GDP is being produced, at the targeted price level P star, which means leftward movement on our Phillips curve back to the natural rate of unemployment U star, and the inflation rate pi star, which is compatible with price stability, where with expansionary fiscal policy making its way through the economy, this means that the economy recovers to a long-run equilibrium at point C. So then with all this in mind, next time we'll pick up with contractionary fiscal policy.